The shortest path to the destruction of democracy is to promote banditry through culture and then attempt to control it by disarming the citizenry. The national left has been following this two-pronged strategy consistently for at least 5 decades, and they've always known perfectly well what the endgame would be: social chaos, followed by a tightening of the regime if they're in power, or insurrectional agitation if they're out of it. This strategy is old, classical, and immutable. But the justifications used to legitimize it vary enough depending on the circumstances of the moment to keep the public disoriented. People get caught up in lively and sometimes ferocious debates over these justifications, never realizing the coherent project lurking behind them. Sometimes, like in Brazil, the public doesn't even grasp that there's any connection between the two simultaneous fronts. Mentally cowardly people would sell their mothers to avoid the risk of being labeled as conspiracy theorists. They degrade themselves to the point of zealously defending the so-called theory of pure coincidences, as if actions could happen without actors behind them. Just imagine the fear these people must feel when faced with acknowledging something that's blatantly obvious everywhere else: that communism did not die in 1990, and is, in fact, stronger than ever, especially in Latin America. 13 years ago, when Jean-François Revel published his last book, La Grande Parade, nobody in Europe or the United States disputed this point, which still remains an esoteric secret in Brazil. There are even those who deny that Dilma or Lula are communists, but they do so because they have no clue what a communist really is. Like most liberals, they think it's a matter of ideals and ideologies. In reality, someone is a communist not because they believe in this or that set of ideas, but because they occupy a position within an organization that acts as part of or as an heir to the communist revolutionary tradition, with all its plethora of varieties and ideological contradictions. The unity of the communist movement, especially since Antonio Gramsci, the American New Left, and the restructuring of communist parties after the dissolution of the USSR, has been more strategic than ideological. In fact, this movement, whose extinction the fall of the Soviet Union seemed to announce as imminent and inevitable, managed to thrive and grow enormously since the early 1990s, precisely because it abandoned any homogeneous doctrinal self-definition and perfected the technique of integrating into a strategic unity the most varied currents and dissidences that had previously been unable to coexist. Therefore, sincere or feigned convictions mean absolutely nothing here. To speak with any authority about the communist movement, one must have studied the following materials. 1. The classics of Marxism: Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong. 2. The major Marxist philosophers: Lukács, Korsch, Gramsci, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Lefebvre, Althusser. 3. Main currents of Marxism by Leszek, Kołakowski. 4. Some good books on the history and sociology of revolutionary movements in general, such as Fire in the Minds of Men by James H. Billington, The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohn, The New Science of Politics by Eric Voegelin. 5. Good books on the history of communist regimes, written from a non-apologetic perspective. 6. Books by the most notable critics of Marxism, like Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, Ludwig von Mises, Raymond Aron, Roger Scruton, and Nicolai Berdyaev, among others. 7. Books on the strategy and tactics of communist power grabs, on the underground activity of the communist movement in the West, and especially on active measures, disinformation, influence operations, such as those by Anatoly Golitsyn, Christopher Andrew, John Earl Haynes, Ladislav Bittman, and Diana West. 8. As many testimonies as possible from former communist agents or militants sharing their experience within the movement or communist governments, like Arthur Koestler, Jan Valton, Ion Mihai Pasipa, Whittaker Chambers, David Horowitz. 9. High-value testimonies on the human condition in socialist societies, such as those by Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Vladimir Bukovsky, Nadezhda Mandelstam, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Richard Wurmbrand. This is a reading program that can be completed in 4 or 5 years by a good student. I know no one, absolutely no one, on either the left or the right in Brazil who has accomplished it. There are so many people in this country wanting to weigh in on this subject, often with airs of wisdom, but almost no one, or practically no one, is willing to make the necessary effort to give some substance to their words. No honest leftist will do this without forever renouncing their beliefs. No rightist will do it without acknowledging that they were a presumptuous fool, and in many cases, a useful idiot. Sometimes even more useful and more idiotic than the leftist masses they claim to oppose. The left thrives on the exploitation of ignorance, both its own and others. Wherever it exercises hegemony, the commandment is to never read the works of its adversaries and critics, but to propagate distorted and caricatured versions of their ideas and biographies, so that the militant youth can hate them under the illusion of understanding them. Universities that claim to teach courses on Marxism go to great lengths in this regard, to the point of pure and simple mind control. The right cultivates its own forms of self-delusion, which I've already discussed at length in this very journal. Perhaps I'll return to this subject in another article.